with you all here today. I said this at the breakout session that there's kind of a double obstacle for you to be here. One, the topic is oftentimes one that is difficult and challenging, and so your willingness to take that on and your willingness to address that is very encouraging for me. And then second, that there's some sort of thing going on out there somewhere that has made people a little bit nervous about gathering together, but I'm very thankful that many of you have taken the risk and the willingness to gather together for a difficult topic like this. I'm also, as always, I'm always privileged when I get to speak in the same conference with Dr. John Perkins. He has been a mentor for so many, but to me in particular, he's been a dear friend and mentor. So I'm always thankful when I get a chance to speak at the same conference as him. So I would love to pray for his health as well, that I know that he travels quite a bit, and that the Lord will continue to protect his health and his well-being, as he has been a blessing for so many of us. Well, I want to begin by confessing to you that I am now well into my 50s. Yes, I am. I know I don't look it. You know, have you heard of the phrase "black don't crack"? I got a new one for you: Asian don't raisin. This is actually true. It's slow aging for us. So on my 50th birthday a couple years back, I decided that I'm going to take very seriously this milestone. And actually at the age of 40, I also made the same discovery, which is I need to get a little more fit. I need to get a little more health conscious and certainly exercise more, and I need to lose a few pounds. And so I made that promise in the 40s and never didn't happen. So I said, all right, in my 50s, this is really going to happen. This is the moment that I'm going to take this physical health thing very seriously. So I'm an academic, I'm a researcher, so the first thing I did, of course, was do research on the topic of fitness and health. And I used a very important academic tool. I'm going to give you a secret, an academic tool. It's called Google. So I went on Google and did my academic research, and I Googled the best physical fitness for someone my age, and something popped up. It was something called CrossFit. Any of you heard of this, CrossFit? Yeah. So I didn't know anything about this until I started doing the research on this, and turns out that CrossFit has been helping a lot of different people, and I really liked the approach that it was, because the approach that it had was something called muscle confusion. And that's a concept that I've lived with my entire life of how to be fit. And the way I've applied it is I don't go to the gym for months and months, and when I go, my muscles are confused. Why are we here? We don't do this. So the idea of muscle confusion, it got me thinking of how sometimes confusion, disruption, a sense of dis-ease, challenges like that, a disruptive confusion, could actually be a good thing. Now, obviously, we're going through a disruptive confusion now in our nation. But are there some good things that come out of it? Some lessons that we can learn about how to take care of ourselves and how church maybe needs to change the way we do things, because this disruption might cause us to do positive change. So I began to think about, what does it mean to have this kind of disruption and confusion in the church or in our nation or for us, because that is what might be needed for change to come. Richard Sennett, who's a philosopher, taught at NYU for many years, put it this way: without a disturbed sense of ourselves, why would any of us ever want to change? That we need that disturbed, disruptive sense in order for change to occur. And I was going through these ideas as I was working on my book on Lament, and after I finished my book on Lament, and realized how much this idea of disruption was absent in the church in America. I was especially noticing this in our worship life, and I was doing research on worship life in the church for my book on Lament, and realized how very little lament is a part of the typical American church. So there was a project that was done by Denise Hopkins, an Old Testament professor at Wesleyan Seminary, and she was examining the way that liturgical churches, Catholic Church, Anglican Church, Lutheran Church, Methodist Church, these churches that are kind of given guidelines on what to preach and what to sing and what passages of Scripture to read, she was noting that even these churches, liturgical churches, would set guidelines on what to read, what to preach, etc. When they got to a hymn, that was supposed to be a lament hymn, or a reading of a passage in the Psalms that was supposed to be a lament psalm, more often than not, these liturgical churches would drop those lament psalms and lament hymns and replace them with happier songs and happier psalms. So even in the liturgical tradition, there was this absence of engaging this very important part of Scripture. Another study was done by looking at Protestants, looking particularly at the Baptist and Presbyterian traditions. And these were churches that used hymnals as their worship guide. And so this author was looking at what percentage of the hymns are hymns of praise and celebration, and what percentage of the hymns are hymns of lament and suffering. Now, if you know in the Old Testament, the book of Psalms, of 150 Psalms, which of course is the worship guideline, oftentimes for the people of Israel, scholars have noted that about 60% of the Psalms in the Bible, in the Old Testament, are Psalms of praise and celebration. But 40% of the Psalms in the Bible are Psalms of lament and suffering. But Glenn Pemberton, who was doing this study in the Baptist and Presbyterian hymnals, found that about 80 to 85% of the hymns in the hymnals were hymns of celebration and praise, and only about 15-20% of our hymns were hymns of suffering and lament. So an underrepresentation, and that was just what's in the hymnals and not what was typically even sung on a Sunday. So severe underrepresentation of suffering, lament, and an exalting of good things and celebration. So I wanted to compare this to contemporary Christian worship music. And some of you know that whenever you project a worship song up on the screen, there's a little number that you're supposed to also project. It's called a CCLI number. It's like a 7 to 8 digit number that allows you to project these contemporary worship songs. Now, I don't know if you know this, but once you project the worship song, you're supposed to call in or send some kind of email or something to let CCLI know that you use that worship song. And so they actually compile, because they want to get the royalties to the right people. So if you use that song and you have a license for it, they compile a list, have a pretty accurate list of the songs that are used on a typical Sunday or typical Saturday at a church. So every summer, actually, in August, they publish the top 100 most popular Christian contemporary worship songs that uses the CCLI license. So pretty much all the contemporary worship songs are cataloged. Every year they publish the top 100 list. So as I'm writing this book on lament, I went through and looked at this top 100 list of every single song and I had my TA do all that work and went through every single song and every single lyric of the top 100 most popular contemporary Christian worship songs. So with that information, we decided to see how many are considered songs of praise and celebration, and how many are considered songs of lament and suffering. Now, how many of you say, just like in the Bible, 40% of our top 100 contemporary worship songs are songs of suffering and lament? How about 25% of our top 100 worship songs are suffering and lament? How about 15%? Do I hear 10%? Well, by my estimation and looking through those lyrics, about 5, maybe 10 out of the top 100 worship songs could be considered lament. And I'm using the word lament as generously as I possibly can. The song is I Cry Out. Yeah, finally a lament song. The rest of the song is I Cry Out for Joy. I'm still going to count it. There's such a pathetic number of these worship songs that talk about lament. Now, what this shows us is the trend in American society and the American church to not engage the disruptive practice of lament and to jump to celebration and victory and everything is good and everything is wonderful, and we don't stay in those places of suffering and pain. And what does that do to our worship life? And what does that do to our Christian life? And does that actually impact the way we interact with one another across races and culture as well? That because we skip over lament to get to the celebration, are we dealing with a theological shortness, a shortcoming in our theology? Is it impacting the way we think about healing, especially along race relations? Well, I want to address this issue through looking at the book of Lamentations. We can look at the next slide here. Lamentations chapter 1, verses 1 and following gives us the context of the book of Lamentations, and I want to talk about the ways that lament can could potentially change the way we look at issues of race. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she who was once great among the nations. She who was a queen among the provinces has now become a slave. So those of you who have not read the book of Lamentation, which is probably most of you, you've certainly maybe not heard a sermon on the book of Lamentations. The book of Lamentations has a particular historical context. And the context is that for many, many years prior to the writing of Lamentations, Israel at one point had been a great nation. So you see this city, which is Jerusalem, had once been full of people, and how Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, was once great among the nations. So if you think about the reign of King David and King Solomon, this is when Israel was at its height, and Jerusalem, as the capital of Israel, was a flourishing nation and a flourishing city. If you go to the next slide. But bitterly now she weeps at night, tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her, they have become her enemies. The next slide. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. So the first three verses in Lamentation teach us that Israel, which had once been a great nation, queen among the provinces, a great nation revered by others around them, had now fallen on very difficult times. And what we know from history is that the Assyrian Empire had come and wiped out most of northern Israel. And then now the Babylonians had come. They laid siege to the capital city of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was now about to be wiped out. And right after the city of Jerusalem gets wiped out, we encounter the book of Lamentations. So this once great city, this once great nation, was no more. In fact, the worst punishment that was inflicted upon them was that they were now sent away into exile. They were no longer allowed to have their homeland, which had been a gift from God to them. They could no longer celebrate that they were God's chosen people because they were now sent away into exile into Babylon. Now, what, again, we know about the history is that the people who were left behind, there was a remnant. When the exile occurred, they took mostly the men, the young men, many who were the literate, the prophets, the priests, the kings, anybody who could read or write was probably sent away into exile. We know this when we look at the book of Daniel. We see Daniel and his friends, young men who were literate, had potential to be leaders. They were taken away into exile. And the only ones that were left behind were the widows, the orphans, the sick, the crippled, the lame, the elderly, those who they felt could not ever rebuild Jerusalem as a city or ever rebuild Israel as a great nation. They were allowed to be left behind. And in fact, they're the ones that are probably the voices that you're hearing in the book of Lamentations. The crippled, the lame, the blind, the sick, the widows and the orphans, the very least of that society that had been left behind, because the ones who were successful, the ones who could read or write, or maybe even rebuild the city, had been sent away into exile. And this is, in some sense, the greatest punishment that Israel could be receiving, to lose their homeland, to be sent away into exile. This is unquestionably the lowest moment in Israel's history. Now, Israel, the people of God at this point have a choice. And if we go to the next slide, slide number 4, they have a couple of options here. And the first option is to run away and hide, to say, hey, look, we've lost it. We've lost our homeland. We've lost our identity. We've lost our leadership. There's nothing left. So let's just give up, run away, and hide. Or to say, what is God doing in the midst of this? And to turn to God for strength and help. In the midst of this decision, Jeremiah writes a letter to the exiles. If we go to the next slide. Jeremiah writes a letter, and this is what Jeremiah writes to them. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile. So he's writing to the exiles in Babylon, from Jerusalem to Babylon. Next slide. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry, have sons and daughters, find wives, and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. So essentially, Jeremiah is saying to those exiles, you need to keep living the life that you were called to as God's people. You can't give up. In fact, the next slide makes it more clear. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. So the people of God have been sent away into exile. They're living in a foreign land. They've lost their homeland, and they're away in this land, and they want to give up. But Jeremiah writes to them and says, you don't have that option. You are not allowed to give up. This is not what God's people do, and that's something I want to admonish you to. You will hit difficult times. Maybe not the exile that's happening here, but there will always be difficult. I was a pastor for 17 years. I know the places and the times that you will hit difficult times. But it's in those moments that we say we do not give up, because God still calls us to seek the peace and prosperity to the places that he has sent you to. This is amazing, by the way, because the peace and prosperity that you were sent to is not Jerusalem. In fact, any other time in the Bible you see the phrase, seek the peace, and a city comes after it, it is always the city of Jerusalem, because that's the heavenly city, the capital of the promised land, all of the good stuff. And this is one of the very few exceptions where you are to seek the peace and prosperity not of Jerusalem, but seek the peace and prosperity of all places in the world, Babylon. Babylon, which, as many of you know, in terms of biblical theology, is just the center of all that is wrong with the world. It is Hollywood, Vegas, Washington, D.C., Wall Street, all rolled into one. That's Babylon. And yet God says the most bizarre thing, seek the peace into the city into which I have sent you. Seek the peace and prosperity of Babylon. Now, the problem is that the history of the church in America has not been, we seek those who are hurting. We seek good in the midst of evil. We see justice. We seek justice in the midst of injustice. The sad story in our history has been, more often than not, we run away when difficult times come. We as a church hide when challenges arise. It's exactly what Dr. King wrote about to the white moderates in the South. And by the way, when he talks about white moderates, he's not talking about evangelicals. That's not even on his radar when he writes the letters from the Birmingham jail. He's talking to actually mainline liberal Protestants. The evangelicals weren't even on his radar as those who were on his side. So we can run away and hide, and that's the kind of the letter that King writes. You can't do that. Or we could seek the peace and prosperity of the broken city that God has called us to. So what we see here, though, is in contrast, like I said, to what we have done over and over again in the church. So one of the things that I study is the history of the church and its engagement with society and culture. Many, many years ago, there was a phenomenon in America called white flight. And what happened was that the cities that had once been teeming with churches and teeming with vibrant communities of faith, mostly white Protestants, began to have some changes occur to these cities. Cities like Chicago, cities like Detroit, cities like New York. And what happened was, first there was a movement of migrants from the South, African Americans, moving to urban centers like Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Baltimore, New York, and also the influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe into these urban centers. And that led to what we now figured out as white flight, which meant that many whites left the urban centers and began to flee to the suburbs. Now, what's interesting about those who fled to the suburbs is that there was a significant growth, go to the next slide, of church buildings that started during this time period. So the height of white flight is post-World War II. And a lot of factors came into play there. There's mortgages and redlining and GI Bill. All these different things allow white Protestants mostly to leave urban centers to move to the suburban communities. And as they're doing it, you're seeing this spike in terms of building projects. So in 1945, only $26 million was spent on new buildings. By 1960, that number jumps to $1 billion spent on new church buildings. Why is that? Because whites were leaving urban centers, mostly abandoning those churches, and moving to the suburbs as African Americans began to move into the urban centers. Now, what I noticed that was interesting, and again, you can see the statistics there of how fast new buildings were going up in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 1970s, is that if a church building was built around that time period, they had a particular architecture. Now, I did this slide without knowing what this building looked like. But take a look at the next slide here. And instead of looking at the slide, you can just kind of look up into the ceiling there. I was noticing that if a church was built, particularly in the Midwest, actually, in the 1960s, 70s, and even into the 80s, they had an architecture that looked like this. It would have been a slanted roof with a little bit of an arch on the side with kind of buttresses. Now, I was at a building dedication in 1970. I was about 8 years old, and our church had just finished building this building. And it was the middle of January. It was a cold winter's day on the East Coast. And I walk into that building, and I see the sanctuary that looks like this. And as an 8-year-old, I knew this is really stupid. This is the dumbest building I have ever walked into, because I'm in a cold weather state in the middle of January, and the heat vents are all along the floor. Where does all that wonderful warm air go? Right up into the rafters. So even an 8-year-old knew this is bad architecture. This is a really bad idea. You have all this warm air up there, so what do you have to build to push down the warm air? Ceiling fans to push down the warm air, and then Pentecostals, charismatics can't come and worship because they keep hitting their hands on the ceiling fan. So you built an architecture and a space that doesn't make sense. All the heat is up there. You literally have the frozen chosen on the ground, and you've got all the warm air up in the rafters. So I'm, as an 8-year-old, irate. I'm like, as an 8-year-old, really upset about all of this. And the pastor gets up, and he says, it was my idea to build the church to look like, why did you do this? It was my idea. And he begins to explain why he built the church to look like this. He said, I want you to picture, go to the next slide, this entire church building turned upside down. And he says, what are you looking at when you turn the whole church building upside down? He says, you're looking at the bottom of a boat. And where do you read about a really big boat in the Bible? Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark teaches you about a really big boat in the Bible. Now, I want you to think about white flight, running away and hiding, and the theological symbolism of a church that sees itself as Noah's Ark. What are you saying to the world around you? We don't care if you live or die. We don't care if the judgment water comes and wipes you out. As long as I'm safe in Noah's Ark, then it's okay. And in fact, that is what happened oftentimes in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Churches focused very much effort on, let's make sure Noah's Ark is safe for us, and let's build a Noah's Ark that is safe for us, and we don't really worry about what's out there. In fact, in Noah's Ark, let's build a little microcosm of the world out there. Because if the world has their secular music, we will have our Christian version of it. So the world has secular literature, we'll have Christian literature. The world has secular colleges, we'll have Christian colleges. The world has secular underwear, we'll have Christian underwear. The world has secular music, we'll have Christian music that's not quite good. We'll have all these Christianized versions in Noah's Ark, because our goal is to be safe in Noah's Ark. Now, how do you do evangelism from an ark? Very badly, very poorly. Here's how you do evangelism from Ark. Uncle Joe floats by. Uncle Joe, we love Uncle Joe. Let's throw a life preserver out there. Bring Uncle Joe onto the ark. We love Uncle Joe. Thank you. You're on this ark because Joe, you're one of us. You know, you look like us, and you clap 1, 3 and not 2, 4, and you like our foods, and we like it that you're similar to us. So you're going to fit right here on Noah's Ark, and so we will pull out 1 or 2 people that fit the culture of this ark. But then your neighbor floats by, and you say, wait a minute, that neighbor borrowed my lawnmower a few weeks ago, and he hasn't given it back. But maybe more to the point, your neighbor looks different from you. He does clap 2, 4 instead of 1, 3. And you look and say, we only brought 1 bottle of sriracha sauce, and he looks like he really likes sriracha sauce. We're going to run out. So we can't really have him on this ark because he's not going to fit in. And you start thinking, I bet there's another ark down the street that's more for his kind of people. And it'll fit better on that ark. It's not about him. It's not about us. We just feel like he'll do better at that other ark. And so maybe we'll let him float away to the other ark. So what we've done is we've created a church culture that ran away and hid from the changes in the world around us. We ran away when things were getting difficult, when things were getting complicated, when things were getting challenging. We decided to run away and hide. So one of the things that we need to think through is, how do we begin to move out of this assumption that there's a certain way that we do things and realize that there is another way that we might need to do things? So for the longest time, based upon these models of ministry, we had what's called the homogeneous unit principle. We grow the church because we hang out with people that are like ourselves. And it did work, but at what cost? It created hyper division and hyper segregation in the church that we're still, many, many years later, still trying to work through. So how do we begin to change these embedded stories and narratives that are very difficult to change? And I want to offer you, if you go to skip a slide here. Go to the next slide. We talked about this in the workshop. And if we go to this slide. When you have an embedded narrative of running away and hiding, an embedded narrative of one way of doing things is better than the other, and you're trying to create a new narrative of unity, crossing racial boundaries, the difficulty is sometimes the narratives are so embedded, it is almost impossible to create a counter narrative. So here's an example. You can't defeat an existing narrative with more of the same narrative. If you have embedded within your system an assumption that the white way of doing things is better than the black way of doing things, you can't have that affirmed and expect that that's going to change. Here's the example. Many years ago, on Super Bowl Sunday, many, many years back, there was a campaign that was launched with much fanfare. It was called the Red Campaign. Millions of dollars spent on a Super Bowl ad. And the Red Campaign featured all the A-list celebrities. Tom Hanks, who now has the coronavirus. Tom Hanks, Denzel Washington, Bono, of course. All these A-list celebrities got up there and talked about the Red Campaign. And they said, we're going to give to the Red Campaign. Now, the Red Campaign was trying to do one thing. It was to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa specifically. Right? That was the goal. Raise money for the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. How were you supposed to raise money for the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa? By buying red-colored products. Remember this? You're supposed to buy a red iPod. You were supposed to buy a red shirt from Target. You're supposed to buy a red tag jeans from Levi's, every single Levi's jean, in other words. So they had this campaign to buy red products to raise money for the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. Ad Weekly, which tracks the effectiveness of advertising, they did a study 10 years later on how well did the Red Campaign work. The Red Campaign spent $10 million in advertising to try to get their business up and going, to try to get the notice out there about the Red Campaign. After 10 years and $10 million spent, how much money did they raise? $10 million. They spent $10 million over 10 years and made nothing. In the meantime, who made all the money? Target, Apple, and Levi's, because we rushed out there to get a red Apple iPod, and we rushed out there to get a red t-shirt from Target, and they made billions of dollars. And how much money actually went to address the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa? Here's the problem. They were trying to fix a narrative with the exact same narrative. I'm going to say something controversial. To some extent, we have a cure for AIDS, to some extent. How do I know this? Many years ago, I'm a seminary student. I'm at a Chili's outside of South Hamilton. And we were there because they had 50-cent fajitas. And so, seminary students were looking for a cheap meal. So we would go there, eat 5 fajitas, and they wanted us to drink, but we didn't drink, so we got a nice meal for $4.50. So we would go there, and every Thursday or so, we would go there for cheap fajitas. And we're there around dinner time, and a newscast comes on. And it was an announcement by someone by the name of Magic Johnson, one of my favorite ball players of all time. And he made an announcement, and what did he announce? I am retiring from basketball because I have the HIV virus, and I've contracted HIV virus. Now, those of you who remember hearing that announcement of Magic Johnson, be honest with me. What was your very first thought? What's going to happen to Magic? He's going to die. 3 months, 6 months. If he's lucky, he's got a year to live. Wonderful player. I was sad that he was going to die. That was about 25 years ago. Anybody seen Magic lately? He's looking a little chunky, actually, if you ask me. He's looking really healthy. Yeah, he's looking really healthy. Because if you live in the United States and you have Magic Johnson's insurance policy, You can live a long, healthy, prosperous life with the medication that is out there if you have that insurance policy. If you have $1 million like Magic Johnson has. What's the problem then? We have something that could effectively cure AIDS, but is it maybe the greed and materialism of the pharmaceutical company that wants to charge the same for an African in Africa that they're charging Magic Johnson's insurance company? So it's not that we don't have medication to send over there. We don't have the will to lose money to send medication to sub-Saharan Africa. So the question is, if the problem is not the absence of a cure, but the absence of the will to overcome our materialism and greed, then can you fix that problem with more materialism and greed? To say we're going to purchase products and that's how we're going to fix the problem of HIV/AIDS. When actually the problem of HIV/AIDS might actually be greed and materialism in the first place. You can't fix a problem with more of the same ideas that created the narratives that created in the first place. So what this shows is, if there is momentum in one direction because of a narrative, racial prejudice, the demeaning and devaluing of black lives, if this is a narrative that is out there, you have to create a counter movement or counter narrative, not be a part of the existing narrative, but be part of creating a new narrative to combat the dysfunction of the existing narrative. We can't do the same things over and over again, expect the same results. We need to create new narratives that change the story. And this is where I want to talk about lament. That we have looked at the issue of race, racial injustice, these injustices, as a problem to be solved by getting people together and jumping up and down. Hey, look, we're together. This is solving the problem. Rather than, what are the counter narratives? Not triumphalistic, but actually might be driven more by lament than by triumph. By brokenness, rather than we're going to fix this thing. By suffering alongside, rather than we're going to lift you up and bring you to a place that we are at. Rather, we're going to have to change and create counter narratives rather than buy into the old narratives that have failed to work. So lament then, I argue, is a way that we begin to enter into a new narrative. Because lament is counter to the existing narrative. Like I said, in the American church, we're so caught up in exceptionalism, triumphalism, we're going to fix the problems, we got it all worked out, that we actually need a new narrative, new communities that offer a counter narrative to the existing narrative. Let me give you a few examples in the book of Lamentations itself. One of the issues around the book of Lamentations is who wrote the book of Lamentations. As I mentioned earlier, the exile occurs, and all the literates, those who could read or write, are sent away into exile. And so the notion has been that if all the literate are sent away into exile, there's probably only one candidate who could have written the book of Lamentations, and that's the prophet Jeremiah. What happened was Jeremiah, in the book of Jeremiah, you see over and over again Jeremiah saying to the city of Jerusalem, you need to give up to the Babylonians because this is the will of God, this is the judgment of God. So the Babylonians thought Jeremiah was on their side. So he's one of the very few prophets, in fact the only prophet, and one of the very few literate who was allowed to stay behind, maybe the only person who was literate. So in that sense, the writing of the book of Lamentations is oftentimes attributed to the prophet Jeremiah because he's probably the only candidate who was literate enough to write down the book of Lamentations. Here's the problem, though. We know Jeremiah's writing and writing style from the book of Jeremiah. And if you compare Jeremiah to the book of Lamentations, it doesn't make sense that the same person wrote it. The style of writing in Jeremiah and the style of writing in Lamentations are so radically different, scholars look at it and say, there's no way that Jeremiah wrote both Jeremiah and Lamentations. It's sort of like, Shakespeare and Kendrick Lamar, right? They're both great writers, right? I mean, one of them has a Pulitzer, the other one doesn't. I'm not saying who, but one of them has a Pulitzer, the other one doesn't. They're both great writers. Chances are Shakespeare and Kendrick are not the same person. Would you agree with me on that? Was Jeremiah probably wrote down those words, right? So he was probably the person, again, as the only literal person, who wrote down those words. But the reason it doesn't sound like him is because he's not the one who's speaking. The ones that are speaking are the women, the children, the broken, the lost, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and the sick. The scenario is this. The exile has occurred. All the literate, all the powerful have been sent away into exile. And so the women, the children, the widows, the orphans, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, the elderly, they all come out to the town square, which is the city gate. And they began to tell their stories. They began to talk about their suffering. They began to talk about their pain. And Jeremiah is there writing down their words. Now, every once in a while, he'll have a place where he speaks as the narrator, as the prophet narrator, but almost all the words that are being spoken are the voices of those who are left behind. In fact, I argue that Lamentations is probably the most feminine book of the Bible, even more so than Ruth and Esther, because it really reflects the voices of women who have suffered the most in this exile. If there's just one lesson that we can take home on this, listen to women a little more. That might be an important lesson. We don't listen to women enough on issues, on any issue for that matter, that what Jeremiah did as the learned person, as the prophet, as the person with all the power and the privilege, is he shuts up and gets out of the way, so that those who haven't had a voice before are able to speak. If there's a lesson that we can learn about a counter-narrative, sometimes we don't need to hear from the experts. Sometimes we need to hear from those who have suffered the most. Sometimes we don't need the whole thing laid out for us and figured out, and here's the answer. Sometimes we just need to sit under the lament of a person who has gone through all these things already. I raise this because I've struggled with this as a person who is supposed to have the things figured out. I've written books on this. I have master's degrees and doctorate degrees on this topic. And so I'm actually, my job is to come into places like this and give the expert opinion on all of these things. But at the end of the day, what I realize is that the real power of transformation in a community is not the expert coming in with all the answers, but it's really the stories that are found right in this room, or maybe the stories that you don't know of yet. I share this because I've gone to too many conferences where the expert gives you all the answers. And I found this over and over again. The experts are always a white man, 29 years old. He looks 50, but he says he's 29 years old. A 29-year-old white man with a nice goatee and the fanciest glasses and the skinniest jeans you've ever seen, talking about how he's going to fix the world with his knowledge and you too can grow your church just the way I grew my church. You too can fix the problems of the world just the way I'm going out there fixing all the problems of the world. And at the end of the day, nothing has changed except that 29-year-old speaker is about a couple of $1,000s richer. And we don't know what it takes to do those things because we think, oh, that expert up there is the one that's going to do all the work. And so what I've started to talk about is, what are the stories in your community that you are not hearing? What are the narratives that have not been heard that counters the existing narrative? So I share a lot about my mom. My mom is in her 80s. She's finished high school but never went to college. Because of a number of different circumstances, she was a single mom that raised 4 kids. And because she was a single mom who didn't speak much English, she took whatever jobs that she could. She ended up working at an inner-city Baltimore carryout. If you ever grew up in the hood, you know the kind of stores I'm talking about. The plexiglass in the front, the bulletproof, and then the little bit of a lazy Susan that passes the money and the food back and forth. That's where my mom worked from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. And then she would rush over to her night job, which started at 11 p.m., went to 6 a.m. And she would be a night attendant, a nurse's aide at a nursing home, inner-city nursing home, where she would change the bedpans and be on call for those who were there. And then she would rush home by 7 o'clock to make sure that me and my sisters, we had breakfast. And she would send us off to school, and then she would sleep for 2 hours and then go back to her day job. And she did this working 20 hours a day, 6 days a week for many, many, many years. She did this because she wanted to keep her family together as a single mom. Now, around that time, our family had to take food stamps because there really weren't a whole lot of options. My mom was working 2 jobs, but she could still barely make ends meet. And so when she took food stamps, the president at that time said, "Oh, you're a welfare queen. Oh, you're lazy. You're stealing from the government. Nobody worked as hard as my mom. 20 hours a day, 6 days a week. And on the seventh day, she went to church and stayed in the kitchen and made food for the pastors and for the elders of the church. Nobody was a harder working woman than my mom was. And yet, the narrative that was out there is, oh, you're a poor immigrant. You're an illiterate immigrant who is stealing from the government, and you're a welfare queen. But her story and her testimony is what changes the world. I know this because despite her limitations that the world told her she had, one of the things that she had the power of was prayer. And she prayed half an hour to an hour to 2 hours a day. She's now in her 80s. When she was in her 60s, she showed me the condition of her knees. Most of us have one kneecap on each knee. She has 5 on each knee because she knelt before God an hour or two every day for 40 straight years. And when you do that, your kneecaps can't take that kind of pressure, so they cracked open. So now when she kneels before God, her kneecaps open up and conform to the shape of the floor. And what drives me nuts is when I go to these conferences to hear that 29-year-old hotshot pastor give you all the answers how you're going to fix the problems of the world. And I go to these conferences too, and they come up to me and say, how am I going to, how can I fix my church? How can I plant my church? And I say, stop coming to these conferences where you're paying thousands of dollars to hear something you should already know. I go to a church planting conference, and the main point is be nice to newcomers. I'm sorry, you should already know that. And you paid $400 in registration for your conference fee, $400 for your flight, $300 for one night at the Hyatt, and $100 every day for meals. You spend nearly $1,500 for a conference to learn something that you should already know. Save that money and just know that the secret to ministry and change is a praying mom and a praying grandmother. The praying moms and the praying grandmothers are the secret to change. And so in this community, look for those praying moms and those praying grandmothers. They might not even speak English, but they pray to God in a way that will put most of us to shame. They might work a menial job that when we look at them, we kind of say, oh, they're the most useless of society. But when they pray and when they worship, heaven and earth moves because of their prayers and because of their worship. This is what it means to change the narrative. Change the narrative as you hear the stories of the praying grandmas and the praying moms, the immigrant mom who is trying to do everything possible to keep her family together. Listen to those stories, and that becomes the way the narratives begin to change. I'll close with one more comment. Lamentations chapter 5 is amazing because what happens is that Jeremiah completely disappears. And in chapter 5, you get a full-fledged lament that comes specifically in the voice of the people and only in the voice of the people. So by the time you get to chapter 5, the people are empowered to begin to pray for themselves. Instead of Jeremiah interceding and kind of giving the background commentary, that's all done. The people of God are empowered to pray for themselves. I began to teach at Stateville Correctional Center. It's in Joliet. It's about an hour outside of the city of Chicago. It is, unfortunately, because of its location, where most of the urban Chicago offenders or criminals or inmates end up going to Stateville. Having taught there now for 3 years, I have learned so many things about that world. It's 90% African American, maybe 8% Latino, a small percentage of white. The injustice of how many of them ended up in jail. The stories that I've heard. Smiley was 16 when he went to jail. He was part of a gang, as many kids his age were at that time. 2 of the older gang members told him to wait in the car, 19-year-olds. They went into a building. He didn't know what they were doing, but in the process of a robbery, they end up killing somebody. They come out. They rush off. Smiley had no idea what was going on. They're all arrested, and the 19-year-olds are charged with murder, but because he was in the car, he was charged as an accomplice, but not even as an accomplice. It's called the accountability principle, and so he was charged with the extreme same crime as the other 2. So the other 2 older kids, they pled out and got 15 years. Smiley said, I wasn't there. I didn't know what was going on. You can't charge me for the same crime. He refused to plead out. He was given a 40-year life sentence. And his is the story that I began to hear when I went to Stateville. Eric was 19 years old when he went to prison. He had graduated high school at the age of 15. Brilliant young man, African American on the South Side. Brilliant young man. He was at DePaul University getting his bachelor's degree, on his way as a successful college graduate. His stepfather, who was involved in drugs in the community and had been abusive towards his mom, had been killed in a drug transaction. The person that actually pulled the trigger said Eric was the one that actually paid me. There was no evidence, no financial trail, no phone calls, nothing that showed that he had paid this person. That person got off with a shorter sentence. Eric was given a 40-year life sentence as well. When you start hearing these narratives, you begin to think of how it changes your perception of what's going on in the world around you. The disposability of black bodies, disposability of young black men, and the belief that by virtue of the color of your skin, you are less important and have less value than others in that society. It has been one of the greatest honors of my life to teach at that correctional center, and it has been one of the greatest honors to try to tell their stories to others. But I want to tell you about a moment that really changed things for me. I go into that prison as a professor, tenured, multiple degrees, an expert in the field of biblical justice and theology. I go in there and I'm trying to teach 15 students, inside students who are in Stateville for a wide range, some who have not committed the crime, some who have, but they're all seeking to better their lives in this class. So I try to come in as the expert, to try to have something that comes in I can offer. I've got it all together after all. I'm the professor. I'm the expert here. But that first semester that I was teaching, I was going through one of the roughest patches of my life. Everything that could go wrong with my life was going wrong at that moment. And I try to keep it together. After all, I'm the expert, I'm the professor. I'm not supposed to show weakness to these prisoners who I'm here to teach and instruct. But I couldn't keep up that facade for very long. Week after week as I would go in, I would be broken down more and more, and circumstances kept getting worse and worse. And finally, about 2/3 of the way through the semester, I couldn't take it anymore. I lost it. And I began to share my weakness and my brokenness to this group of men who were there at Stateville. And I broke down very much like I'm doing now. I started weeping in front of them. I was very embarrassed because these are tough men who are in prison, and I'm a small guy. And as I'm sharing my weakness, as I'm sharing my brokenness, Corzell Cole comes over. Corzell, 6'4", 200 pounds, cut. Tattoos, gold teeth. He's what you would say, oh yeah, Chicago Southside gang member. That's what he looks like. Corzell comes over and he whispers in my ear, you know I'm going to get in trouble for this. And then he gives me a massive bear hug and he holds me in my arms for several minutes. And he did get in trouble because you're not allowed to touch as prisoners, as inmates with a professor. But he held me until I was able to work through the pain that I was experiencing. The very next week, Michael, I don't know how he figured it out. They don't really have internet access, but he learned how to say, my dear brother, I love you in Korean, and said that to me at the beginning of class. William J., 60 years old, he was on death row before the governor before the Illinois government decided to do away with death row. So now he has a life sentence, but he's now in his mid-60s. And now he paints, and he shares his work, his life through art. And he said, I have a painting for you, and it's a painting that I thought of you as I was painting it. Apparently he thinks I'm a black man with an afro, because it was a picture of a black man with an afro charging the gates of hell. And he said, this is what I'm thinking of when I see you. It is in those moments that you realize that with all our education, with all our learning and all our knowledge, at the end of the day, it is the grandma with the broken knees, and it is the person with a life sentence still seeking after God. Those are the places that your life gets transformed. So my challenge to you as a movement, and I believe this is a movement, is to seek the voices that have been silenced. Seek the stories and the narratives that are on the margins. And through those stories, the stories of lament, suffering, and brokenness, through those stories, be healed as a community. Thank you.